the Broly Second Coming as a basic outline of the structure of the final mission, which, having been triggered in the original estimate from the military intelligence, uh, from the copy sent to me, generates a series of malicious conflicts in the War on Terror as an extension of the wars in the Middle East of the 90s in order to eradicate David's forces, which, having been built, would have accelerated well beyond the white nationalists' ability to have ever caught up, at which point David, as the premier military force, would be independently capable of functioning as the military for the United States government, at which point the Americans, having a military exclusively loyal to the agreement, would be the primary justification of the insurrectionist targeting of David, which would facilitate their objectives in the original estimate of David being hunted to be killed in the war by the proxy agents, which, having been hyper accelerated by the white nationalists in order to facilitate the extreme dangers generated, such as 9/11, which was a KKK operation of the white nationalist double agents who, operating as druids with different denominations throughout the United States, are religious radicals who are engaged in all kinds of black market operations, including the child sacrifice network, which does not require the death of the child so much as the existence of the prolonged abuses against the children, which would facilitate lifelong incarceration through the use of surveillance human trafficking, such as the one referred to by Lindsey Graham in his many escapades in eradicating the United States' stability or competence or existence, at which point, with the complete overthrow of the United States, you have the catastrophic white nationalist threat against the world, which generates the prompting of their original obligation to have gotten rid of David, which requires them to have killed him as a child, and the younger that they attack him, um, the easier it would be to get him killed. Otherwise, he would hyper accelerate in power, exceeding their capacity to do so. At which point, the war on terror being generated would be their last ditch effort to be able to accomplish this mission, which has the military intelligence project the actual winning of the long term relationships, which functions in the Broly movie as Videl, which is based upon the position of their estimate of the uh, former Soviet Union buying the zombie insurance in order to turn down the Iron Curtain, blocking the economic exchanges, which would have facilitated David's ability to have stabilized it and its long term objectives, manifesting their benign power, which would have neutralized the long term objectives of the white nationalists in order to have the propaganda stabilize in the spell, justifying their eradication, which they want to do no matter what and require unitary executive theory in order to push through regardless of resistance by the American people, as the complete bypassing of all American systems disconnected from service of law or competence would be the primary function of the white nationalist systematic racism, including their racist position to eradicate all Slavs, which postures their objective in this system, at which point the Slavs, having been projected of winning the insurance structure, would have ingested David's insurance structure's savings throughout the world, from the long-term historic position of the Legend of David companies in its treaties and collaborations with the other nations, which would have generated the exponential amount of wealth, facilitating the chosen to oversee the insurance structure uh, for the mechanism as the highest grade competent candidates chosen by those who generate the confidence by investing and backing in the most likely to succeed, because if the male buys the board out, then the board has sold at the better preferred prices which manifest their returns or margins as they cash out, at which point whoever they choose to back is based upon these estimates and high competence capabilities, which facilitates the diversity of the threat, which generates the revenge X's who are engaged in the permanent retaliation of targeting David for terrorism and humiliation and defamation, which exponentially compounds on itself for the position of coercing different people from having associations, including the original dating options, which would have stacked around him and generated an exponential line waiting for their turn, which facilitates the the act of the massive reduction of human decency by the criminal reduction of status, which includes the defamation for the lower lows in the reduction of status defamation, at which point the act of holding David is an act of defamation. At which point, the winner, having been won, had asserted the position of the X's from the original estimate retaliation, which would, in this version, have engaged in prompting the Russian Federation to invade Ukraine as the proxy war, with the White Nationalist Confederacy as the backup function of protecting the interest of the original order without David there to maintain the original peace, which is conducted by the restraints of the white nationalists, prevented David from conducting the actual functioning order, which compelled the retaliation as the lawful action of the Russians is a direct reaction to the prompting and threats against the national security and interest of the Russian Federation. At which point, the white nationalists are exclusively responsible for the war in Ukraine. And as an alternative to that, you had the war on terror, which was also their fault, as they had arranged their terrorist insurgents from the previous wars in the Middle East, funding the Mujahideen and many of the other groups, establishing a CIA-styled executive secret government function, which is a direct copy of the CIA functions, which manifests the white nationalist phantom cell structure, which is actively maintained in its connections with the white nationalists inside the United States military, which, having stopped temporarily the Nazi overthrow of the United States by the FBI, has actively been encouraged to overthrow the United States from the position of the military, generating the position of the judges of those with power cannot be retaliated against, and thus there is no functioning checks and balances, which manifests the position of overthrowing the legal government, as there is no more constitutional republic, as they are fascist white nationalist insurrectionists who are exclusively in control, as they systematically dismantle the function of the memory of the host, that is the United States, which required them to remove the high priority targets of its original uh, members who are loyal to it, including David as a character, which facilitated the military intelligence, which conducted the oversight functions and the military police functions of arresting the any double agent found, which would have manufactured David as the highest threat to their existence, as they are unredeemable insurrectionists, and in that action would have had to have killed him in the war on terror, which generates the position of them systematically setting up the proxy wars by funding of terrorist organizations, as David is sent on these missions in order to have him killed during these arrangements, which facilitates the last mission, which they would have actively arranged, determining the operation of expending all of his resources, at which point the systematic game of cat and mouse of exchanges would require them to strategically have made an agreement with David and the terrorist white nationalist enemies on how the game is supposed to be played, as they expire all of their equipment in the most strategically viable mechanism, which would mutually be understood in their settlements in military tactics, manufacturing the expiration of the equipment um, ahead of schedule, at which point the system of it being exponentially depleted through these contests would have actively manufactured large-scale war against higher technological advantages, at which point David's functions would have been superiorly outnumbered, but not outmatched, at which point the expiration of these major forces would have specifically been tailored to fight each other, manufacturing the conclusion of mass financial devastation on all ends. At which point, the position from, I believe it was Ants, when the General Ants ordered the Queen's Guards to invade and destroy the, what do you call it, the termites, which is basically just a suicide mission. At which point, that is basically what that function would be. Manufacturing this position in the conflict was projected and rejected under the assumption that it would be inadequate to have substantively defeated David, as he is superior to them in their own minds, as a perpetual permanent oppression on their white nationalist objectives in their religious radical psychopathy, which generates the systems of their permanent retaliations. Now, the position of the Revenge X would have pulled the projected winner into the conflict, requiring David to have retaliated as the function, at which point the system that she would have been conducting would have hyper accelerated the power on the loan, at which point the dividing of resources away from her original obligations in the settlements of the economic stability would have been replaced to the alternative responsibility of the person taking the loan in order to gain the exponential increase of the equipment, at which point the facilitation of this trade manufactures the overwhelming force on their side, which would generate the contest, at which point her getting pulled into the fight directly as a collective organization or company does not require her to physically, as a person, be involved in the function, at which point the attack against her company would have threatened its existence, at which point the systems require David to make the settlement on their evacuation schedule, which would have generated his mass exhaustion in order to have secured against the determined casualties from the overwhelming force from the conflict, at which point the assumption is that David would have conducted the evacuation into uh, down the Arabian Peninsula in towards Africa, at which point they assumed at some point, I think they believe it was just beyond Madagascar, he would have exited his fleet, as the position of additional forces attacking the rear would have been exponentially too aggressive for them to have been able to handle in single combat, and they would systematically send naval forces and other units along the border in order to generate slowing down tensions, at which point their naval ships coming at the front would have actively blocked them, at which point the inability to have pushed through them and successfully destroyed them would have delayed, which would expire the time as the rest of the fleet would have caught up with them, generating the permanent eradication of the fleet, which was assumed to be inadequate for that function under the total arrangements, as David's missions under the secret protocols would have systematically dismantled their capability of performing this to in any substantive matter for the success of their